Hello, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the new Wild West, the oil and gas industry's push for carbon capture and storage in Ohio. My name is Ben Hunkler. I'm the communications manager at the Ohio River Valley Institute. We are a nonpartisan research organization working to chart a course toward clean energy, shared prosperity, and more equitable civic structures in Ohio and across the Ohio River Valley region. You can learn more about our work on our website at www.ohiorivervalleyinstitute.org. My colleague Tom Torres is on the call. He is our hydrogen program director. And we're thrilled to be joined also by Julia Kane with oil and gas watchdog Fieldnotes, and Bev Reed and Kat Finneran with the Buckeye Environmental Network. Sean, it's great to see you also. Hope you're doing well. A few quick notes before I hand things over to Bev. We are recording tonight's presentation. We've enabled closed captions, which you can access at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Um, and we will go through a series of presentations tonight and take questions at the end, but do feel free to drop those questions in the chat or the Q&A box at any time, and we will get to those in the order that they are received. Send me a message if you need anything, and I will pass it over to Bev to get us started.
Thanks, Ben. Hello and welcome to this webinar on carbon capture and storage. We just wanted to share a bit about Buckeye Environmental Network at the outset of the webinar. If this is your first time joining us for an event like this, welcome. We're a 30-plus-year-old Ohio-based grassroots environmental nonprofit organization. Thanks for joining us this evening from wherever you may be in Ohio or beyond. And after Tom and Julia present their fantastic portions for you all, Kat Finneran and I will be discussing our work on carbon capture in Ohio. And we will tell you about why the geology is particularly vulnerable and risky for carbon capture in this state. We will share some experiences from working with people who have been directly impacted by this vulnerable geology I'm referring to. And we will give you real examples of successes we've had working on various other types of injection wells, and we'll share some ways you can get involved in making a difference. Please stick around for the whole webinar and write your questions down for us. And Tom, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Bev and everyone. Good evening. My name is Tom Torres. I'm the Hydrogen Program Director at the Ohio River Valley Institute. I spend most of my time tracking developments related to hydrogen and CCS throughout Appalachia, and with an emphasis on the Appalachian parts of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Today, I'm going to be spending some time talking to you about Ohio's House Bill 170. Before I do that, I just want to provide a little bit of background on CCS, which stands for Carbon Capture and Storage. So CCS involves the point source capture of CO2. In our context, this is typically from large industrial emitters. You might also see direct air capture projects where the CO2 is captured from the ambient air. But again, in our context, we're typically talking about industrial emitters, and that CO2 is then injected into underground storage projects through injection wells. The hope is that once injected into those storage structures, the CO2 will remain trapped for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. And because of that, CCS has been suggested as a potential climate mitigation tool. However, I think it's important to note right at the top, and something to keep in mind throughout this presentation, that the technology underpinning CCS has to date been primarily associated with the fossil fuel industry. And this also includes the injection of CO2 into aging oil wells, primarily like in the Midwest, the Gulf, et cetera, in order to stimulate production in a process called enhanced oil recovery, or EOR. As we'll see on this next slide, the CCS proposed in our region is primarily associated with fossil fuel power plants and the production of hydrogen from natural gas. I think something I always like to talk about is, like, why are we talking about this at all, right? Why Appalachia? And again, that fossil fuel connection is a big part of this, right? Along with the region's geology, right? The assessments that the subsurface geology in our region is, could be potentially used for storing and trapping CO2 for long periods of time. But I think it's also important to note that, these companies are also looking at our political and regulatory environment, which I think is very favorable towards this kind of industry. And it's one of the reasons that our region has been targeted for CO2 storage. One example of this, a pretty prominent one that I think a lot of you have heard about, is ARCH2, the Appalachian Hydrogen Hub. So ARCH2 is a proposed network of hydrogen producers and consumers that would, again, span Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. If built, the hub would require substantial CCS infrastructure, including storage facilities. There's almost no information available about that component of the project, but it's important, again, to kind of keep in mind when you're hearing this, this push for hydrogen from natural gas. In our context, it's, there's usually a CO2 storage project kind of off in the wings. And I also kind of want to note too, and this will be a little bit of a theme throughout, but the hub has encountered significant challenges and its future remains doubtful. Since first being announced in 2022, the hub has lost several key development partners. 5 of the original 15 projects that were announced in 2022 have been removed from the slate, and one of the 3 primary anchor facilities suspended development of their blue hydrogen project earlier this year. And then more recently, you may have seen in the news that the hydrogen hub itself is at risk of losing both its federal funding and its federal designation. Um, the other project I kind of want to note at the top is Tenaska's Tri-State CCS Hub. Unlike the hydrogen hub, this project intends to provide CO2 storage capacity for other emitters rather than presumably kind of doing both at the same time. And based on the documents that we've been able to review, it seems the company Tenaska is primarily targeting power plants in our region, but it's also looking at other industrial emitters in Ohio, PA, and West Virginia. A few other things to be aware of. The CCS hub intends to inject a minimum of 50 million metric tons of CO2 each year for 30 years. And the storage facility consists of, I think, 22 injection wells, again, in those 3 states. And the storage facility would span 80,000 acres of pore space. That pore space, reflects an area that's larger than any state forest in the region and 4 times larger than any state park. So yeah, these are, again, when you're thinking about these projects or, this bill, HB 170, to be thinking about these projects as well. All right, so one of the things you'll often hear from backers of these projects, and you'll also hear kind of, talked about in the context of this bill, is that we have a lot of experience with CO2 storage, and this just couldn't be farther from the truth. There has been a lot of CO2 injection to support enhanced oil recovery. Again, that's the use of injecting CO2 into aging oil wells to stimulate additional production. Those are class 2 wells, and those are very different from class 6 wells, which are the wells used for these deep geologic storage projects. This is something that the EPA, was very front of mind for EPA when they created the class 6 well program. They stated that these storage projects need their own standalone well class because of the unique characteristics of CO2, the higher pressures involved, the larger volumes of injected material, and of course, the potential for seismicity. Something else, I guess, to kind of keep in mind in terms of the, again, the record and experience with these kinds of projects. The program was established in 2010, and since then, about 24 Class 6 permits have been issued. However, only 4 geologic storage projects are currently injecting CO2. In other words, the developers and regulators in the US have very little practical experience with these kinds of wells, and the industry has a near absent track record. Let me see what else. So because of the design of those facilities, and again, some of the stuff I mentioned earlier, including the unique characteristics of CO2, there are various risks to be aware of in the context of these storage projects, including potential impacts to drinking water. A lot of the federal regulations around, these storage projects are primarily focused on drinking water, which is important, but it also doesn't really do a lot to address issues outside of that area. And then, of course, project failure due to leaks. Something to keep in mind in terms of our region and including Ohio is the presence of likely hundreds of thousands of orphan and abandoned gas wells. And each of those wells could potentially serve as a conduit for CO2 to escape these storage projects. The fact that they are here and they haven't been addressed, we don't know where a lot of them are, really increases the risk of leak or project failure or impacts to water quality, right? Where we see, CO2 that's injected and intended to stay in one place can unintentionally migrate somewhere else. Right. And then something else to kind of keep in mind in the context of how federal regulations interact with the nature of these projects and some of the very unique challenges in our region. Is that the developers of these storage projects are required to identify issues like this, right? They're called artificial penetrations, but they only need to plug, at least in this context, and for like when they're thinking about artificial penetrations that are these orphan and abandoned gas wells, they only need to plug the wells that they themselves deem to be a risk to underground sources of drinking water, right? And something else to keep in mind as well is that much like these legacy wells, the state may end up being saddled with additional long-term obligations if the developers of those CO2 storage projects are able to transfer their liability to the state, which is one of the provisions in House Bill 170. And I and Julia will talk about that a little bit later on. So those are a few of the kind of general risk and kind of context for CO2 storage. And something else to keep in mind is just the issue of CO2 pipelines, right? Particularly for the Tri-State CCS hub. So unless these storage facilities are co-located with their CO2 emitters, pipelines are going to be needed to transport CO2 to the point of injection. And a lot of the issues that I've raised here also carry over in a way to CO2 pipelines, right? For example, the presence of water can cause CO2 to form carbonic acid, which can then impact the subsurface geology, the injection well itself, other plugged or unplugged wells, and of course, pipelines. I should also point out that, like with geologic storage of CO2, we also have relatively little operational experience with CO2 pipelines compared to the potential build-out we might see under various decarbonization scenarios. So as of now, the US has 80% of the world's CO2 pipelines, but that only amounts to a little over 5,000 miles. One estimate from the Department of Energy envisions a national CO2 pipeline network growing nearly 13 times that size, right? So again, I think to me that reflects a pretty serious knowledge gap in terms of the operation of CO2 pipeline networks. And I think something else to keep in mind as well is that the existing CO2 pipeline network primarily transports CO2 from high purity natural sources. Again, a lot of these are associated with the enhanced oil recovery. And in contrast to that, the projects that we're looking at here are primarily industrial sources of CO2 associated with power plants, hydrogen production facilities, et cetera. And so again, this kind of introduces another operational challenge and potentially another knowledge gap that the industry will have to address. All right, so that was a little background on CO2 storage. We probably could have spent the whole time on that, but I hope that was helpful. I want to also talk about some of the major elements of the bill, which is currently moving through the Ohio legislature. So this is House Bill 170. I think the first thing to note right at the top is that House Bill 170 is often described as a CCS bill, but it's actually only focused on CO2 storage. The bill does not address other aspects of carbon management, such as the capture of CO2, the siting of CO2 pipelines. It doesn't address the existing issues with the federal regulations, environmental justice, et cetera, right? And so I wanted to mention this at the top because there are a lot of questions and issues that come up in the context of these discussions, and those issues have just been totally left out of the conversation surrounding this bill. The other thing I want to note is that there are, when you're thinking about House Bill 170, there are broadly two sets of provisions, right? And so you have first these like basic regulatory questions that the bill is trying to address, but then there's a second set of industry carve-outs, and there's a little bit of conflation between the two, and so I kind of want to spend some time unpacking that a little bit. And by that I mean is that you'll often hear supporters of this bill and similar bills like it that this legislation is intended to clarify the regulatory environment and establish regulations to enable these kinds of projects. And this is partly true. The bill does include provisions that do address these kind of very fundamental questions that are not addressed by federal regulations. Things like who owns the CO2 that's injected? Can you sell or lease the geologic areas used for CO2 storage, also known as pore space? How do rights to pore space interact with surface rights and mineral rights like oil and gas interests? And of course, there needs to be some designing of the state's permitting program. And so House Bill 170 does accomplish that. It asserts that pore space is tied to surface rights. Unless otherwise severed, pore space can be leased and sold. The mineral rights are dominant over pore space rights. And this is more or less what you'll see from, with a few differences here or there when you look at similar CO2 storage regimes in other states. And so again, that is kind of like the first class of issues here, right? Like just the very basic enabling regulations, right, that provide that fundamental clarity for developers to decide whether they want to bring their projects to Ohio. But House Bill 170 goes well beyond addressing those basic questions and instead includes provisions that serve these private developers at the expense of the public and landowners. So the first of the three that I want to address is unitization. So House Bill 170, and this is a little complicated, but we have a diagram, so hopefully that will be useful. But House Bill 170 allows developers of CO2 storage projects to inject CO2 under homes and property without necessarily having the permission of the landowner. This concept is sometimes referred to as collective storage, or more accurately, forced or compulsory unitization. The bill euphemistically refers to it as statutory consolidation, right? Which sounds just very innocuous until you find out what it actually represents. And I guess I'll have to say that like this sort of thing is not that uncommon, and it also follows similar policies for oil and gas development, but it makes it no less egregious, right? Like I think this is something that should be of concern to anyone in Ohio, especially landowners. And I think I guess I also want to note too that when this bill was being introduced in committee, one of the co-sponsors of House Bill 170 said that the goal of the bill was to quote, give the state of Ohio and Ohioans more control over carbon sequestration projects. In fact, what this bill actually does is give carbon sequestration projects control over Ohioans. The other thing I think I want to note here is that just a little bit more about how that kind of functions in practice. And so the way that the bill is designed is that developers don't even have to secure permission from a majority of the landowners affected by a storage project. Instead, developers they only have to secure permission from landowners representing 70% of the target storage area. And that threshold does not necessarily reflect a numerical majority, as you can see in this example, right? And so in this graphic here, this is a hypothetical 1,000-acre storage project. Each square, which I hope you can see there, it's a bit small on my screen, but each square in this graphic represents 1 acre. As you can see, those 1,000 acres are owned by 12 different owners, but 2 of the owners are much larger than the rest. If the developer obtains permission from those 2 larger landowners, the remaining 10 are unable to opt out of the project and will be forced to store CO2 under their homes or properties. And so that's baseline what this bill would allow. Something else to keep in mind is that fundamental risk associated with this bill only increases if the state is allowed to include large tracts of public land in these storage projects, which is something that West Virginia allows in its state law. So pretty concerning stuff. And again, there's just like when people talk about this, they kind of like sidestep it a little bit, or you'll see some confusion again, and it's they'll point to that 70% threshold, but again, that 70% is not 70% of landowners. It's landowners representing 70% of the storage project, which could be one person, right? Could be one company, could be, yeah. So the second of the 3 provisions that I want to highlight here is liability transfer. So this is a provision that allows developers to offload liability for their own storage projects onto the state and the public. In other words, storage developers are able to profit from the operation of their facilities for however long they're injecting CO2, and then have the public assume the project's long-term regulatory and financial obligations. And so shielding developers from liability, really severing them from their responsibility in this way, I think incentivizes them to cut corners. If they're not responsible for the long-term consequences of their decisions, what kind of behavior is this inviting from the companies that are building and operating these facilities? I think it's important to note that these are unfortunately not that uncommon for states that have CCS regulations, but again, I think they're still pretty serious. That being said, the next 2 elements I want to talk about here, I think are pretty unusual in the context of some of these state CO2 storage regimes, both for the region and nationally. Yeah, so this one, again, pretty unusual, but yeah, so House Bill 170 includes language that allows or that ensures the protection of oil and gas interests in a few different ways. For example, the bill requires these storage projects to be isolated from any existing or future oil and gas production. It also calls for setbacks to establish a buffer between oil and gas resources and CO2 storage facilities. What this bill doesn't do is provide that same protection to sensitive areas such as churches, schools, environmental justice areas, parks, and so on. Worse, the bill actually prevents local communities from taking those steps themselves, and which brings us to this, I think, the last provision that I want to talk about, the state preemption. And so House Bill 170 includes language that asserts that the state has, quote, sole and exclusive authority over these storage projects. Again, essentially preempting any local measures to protect these sensitive areas or communities from any of the risks that I've been talking about here. I'm not aware of any other state that has, something like this, right, that preempts local action in this way for CO2 storage projects. But I do want to point out that in 2024, legislators in Pennsylvania passed a bill that includes the consideration of aggregate and community impacts when permitting these CO2 storage projects. That bill was far from perfect, but the bill also authorized regulators to consider additional or to call for additional impact assessments for these projects in environmental justice areas. And so I wanted to mention that because I think these two bills side by side serve as examples of the steps that legislators can take to either reduce the risk or increase the risk of these projects. All right, so we're kind of winding down here. I just want to say a little bit about kind of the current landscape for the policy and this industry in Ohio. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the regulatory process. Broadly, this involves three steps. First, the state needs to pass a bill that designs that regulatory regime that we've been talking about for CO2 storage. As of now, that's House Bill 170. It recently cleared the House. It's currently awaiting consideration in the Senate. After that bill is passed and signed into the law, at some point, the state will then need to promulgate rules based off that legislation in order to execute the program that's called for in the bill. And then those rules would then make up part of the state's application to the Environmental Protection Agency when they request primary permitting authority over the CO2 injection wells. This is what's known as Class 6 primacy, where Ohio is seeking primacy over the Class 6 well program, which is otherwise, in most states at least, operated or managed by the EPA. Um, so yeah, I think something to note there is that Ohio is pretty early in the process, right? But again, a lot of the decisions, or a lot of the, yeah, just the design of that program, this is a really important milestone for that. And so again, like what we see in this bill is what we're going to see in the rules, and that those rules are going to be part of the state's application. So pretty critical moment for this process. Um, yeah, and then something else I want to say, just because again, I feel like there's all these like talking points that I've heard from legislators and some of the companies that support these projects or are wanting to develop them themselves, and they're very similar to arguments that I've seen elsewhere. And I've tried to kind of like pop those balloons, throughout this presentation. And I think the last one I want to talk about is that, when boosters of CCS projects are, speaking in support of primacy, or the need for these clarifying regulations, what they often say is that that's what's needed to attract prospective developers. And I think there's something to it, right? Like again, there's some of these like fundamental questions that a company probably wants answered before they decide whether or not they want to locate a project somewhere, right? But I think like the part to me that's doesn't really like totally land well is the fact that having this is going to just automatically attract all these projects, right? And that those projects will be built. And we can look to other states to see how this has played out. For example, Iowa and South Dakota have relatively weak or non-existent CO2 storage regimes, and those states have seen a significant amount of interest from CCS developers. Closer to home, Pennsylvania passed a CO2 storage bill in 2024, no Class 6 permit in PA. West Virginia has passed several pieces of storage legislation, over the last several years, I think over the last 4 or 5 years. And then it also received Class 6 primacy from EPA, and is, now reviewing its own Class 6 permits, but they've only received two, right? And those were permits that were transferred from EPA that were being reviewed by the region and are now being reviewed at the state level. And so I guess the point that I want to make there is that despite the fact that Ohio is lagging behind both Pennsylvania and West Virginia in terms of developing the storage regulations and securing primacy over the Class 6 well permit, Ohio has seen more Class 6 applications than both of those states combined. So I just wanted to make that point again, because this is one of those things you hear pretty often. And then you can see the 5 applications for the CO2 injection well permits that are under review in Ohio, various states review. I expect 2 of these are probably going to move to a decision next year, but there's been a lot of delays with these and obviously a lot of disruptions at the federal level. So a bit of an open question, but I don't think it's out of the question for 2 of them to move ahead. And then just in closing here, I think we're not going to get into this a whole lot today. We've done a lot of work on this. We'll include some resources on this in our follow-up, and you can look at our materials on our website to learn more about this. But I think it's important to note that the economics of CCS and hydrogen mean that these kinds of projects have a pretty steep hill to climb. And these facilities, if they're built, would introduce a lot of new industrial activities that we haven't seen in our region, haven't seen in Ohio. And those activities also bring along, potential new health and safety risks. Communities in our region, Appalachian families are going to experience potentially increase costs due to the tax credits, because those are some of the incentives available to the developers of these companies, whether they're producing hydrogen or injecting CO2. There are tax credits from the federal government that support that. And then there's also the potential for these companies to recoup their costs from ratepayers if CCS is able to embed itself in the power sector, right? And so in other words, Ohioans could potentially pay for these projects twice, first with higher utility bills and then again with higher taxes. So as I mentioned earlier, there are steps we can take to reduce the risks associated with these projects and minimize the impacts on local communities. Unfortunately, the legislators advancing this bill have done so at the best of industry and are choosing the opposite route. So yeah, and I think maybe that's a great segue for Julia. So thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Julia Kane, and I'm a researcher with Fieldnotes, which is an investigative watchdog focused on the oil and gas industry. And I'm going to talk to you tonight about an investigation that we published a couple months ago that found that the oil and gas industry has been pushing carbon capture in Ohio. Next slide, please. And so, as I said, it's really the oil and gas industry that has been behind this push. I'm going to break this presentation up into three parts. In the first part, we're going to talk a little bit about the national context. In the second part, we're going to zoom into Ohio and talk about how the bill in your state has come together. And in the final section, we're going to talk a little bit about why the oil and gas industry is so interested in this and what they're hoping to get from this legislation. Next slide, please. One of the reasons that the oil and gas industry is so interested in carbon capture and storage is the 45Q tax credit. And this is a tax credit that's existed since 2008 that companies can claim for sequestering CO2 underground. But in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act boosted that tax credit from up to $50 per metric ton to up to $85 per metric ton. And this has made the economics of some of these projects more attractive to the industry. Next slide. This is a quote that underscores that point, and this comes from an American Petroleum Institute executive speaking before an Ohio Senate committee last year. And she said, "Carbon capture has become the new Wild West, the new Spindletop in Texas, the new Colonel Drake well in Pennsylvania, where there is a lot of money to be made." Next slide. Now, of course, before industry can try and make that money, they need to get permits. And Tom talked about this a little bit in his presentation, but the oil and gas industry would much rather work with state oil and gas regulators as opposed to federal regulators at the EPA. And to that end, groups like the American Petroleum Institute are pushing states to apply for Class 6 primacy so that states can regulate these things. This is a slide from a presentation that API gave at an industry conference last year that highlights which states are moving ahead with primacy. It's a little bit out of date right now, but the states that have received primacy are North Dakota, Wyoming, Louisiana, West Virginia, and New Mexico, and we expect that Texas will probably get it pretty soon. Next slide. And of course, before a state can receive primacy, they need to have laws and regulations on the books. And to that end, API was tracking about 24 states that have either proposed or passed CCS legislation, including Ohio. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to zoom in and get into the specifics in Ohio. So last legislative session, lawmakers proposed two CCS bills. In the House, it was sponsored by Representative Monica Robb Blaisdell, and in the Senate, it was co-sponsored by Senators Tim Schafer and Al Landis. They worked on these bills behind the scenes, but they did not actually vote them out of committee last session. Next slide. Fast forward to this legislative session, and they have now reintroduced these bills. This time in the House, Rep. Robb Blaisdell has been joined by Rep. Bob Peterson as a co-sponsor. Rep. Peterson has the Valero ethanol plant in his district, so one of his constituents has a significant interest in this. And then on the Senate side, Senator Al Landis has been replaced by Senator Brian Chavez. I think that name will be familiar to a lot of folks on the call. Senator Chavez comes from the oil and gas industry. Before he was elected to the Senate, he ran a company called Deep Rock Disposal Solutions that deals with fracking waste. Next slide. What our investigation found, though, is that even though these lawmakers are the public face of the bill, the real organizations that have been leading this charge are the American Petroleum Institute, or API, which is the largest oil and gas trade association in the country, and the Ohio Oil and Gas Association. Next slide. And of course, when we're talking about these trade associations, we're really talking about the oil and gas corporations that they represent. So you've got some of the oil giants like ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell. You've got some names that I know are very familiar to folks in Ohio: Ascent Resources, Expand, EOG, and Diversified. And this is just some representative companies. Obviously, there are a lot more included here. Next slide. So in Ohio, our investigation found that API and UGA drafted the bill, they selected the sponsors, they met with the sponsors at least a dozen times and exchanged over 150 emails with them and their staffs. I'll add that these are counts that we did over the summer. I think those have probably increased throughout the fall. They vetted each and every version of the bill with their industry members. They provided expert witnesses for hearings. They supplied lawmakers with talking points championing CCS. They enjoyed extraordinary access to lawmakers, including once over a meal at a white tablecloth restaurant, and they offered to coordinate positive media coverage of these bills. Next slide. So the investigation that I'm going to talk to you about, I think provides a glimpse at how these oil and gas corporations wield their power and how they translate that into favorable legislation. All of the screenshots that I'm going to show you tonight come from public records requests that we submitted to the Ohio Department of Natural Resources and to the Ohio legislature. I do want to make a note that Ohio recently changed its public records law, and so some of these records will now be either impossible or more difficult to get, which is a blow to transparency in the state and is going to make investigations like this more difficult going forward. But I'll take you through what we have here from this investigation. The process really kicked off about 2 years ago in November of 2023, and that's when API and UGA started circulating the draft bill that they had written. This is an email from Christina Polisovsky, who is an associate director at API Ohio, and she's reaching out to Eric Vendel, who is the chief oil and gas regulator at the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. In this email, she writes, "Please find the draft bill UGA and API Ohio have compiled with feedback from our members and technical consultants." So I don't think there's any doubt as to who wrote this bill. Next slide. Now, once the industry had a bill, they needed lawmakers to introduce it. So Christina Polisovsky, the API Ohio executive, approached the Ohio Republican chief of staff and the House Majority Policy Director to ask who they recommended to sponsor this bill. They recommended Rep. Rob Blaisdell, and then then API vetted Rep. Rob Blaisdell with industry before approaching her. So this is an email from the API executive to Devin Babcock, who was the House Majority Policy Director at the time. And in it, API writes, "We've also floated her, Rep. Rob Blaisdell, to other stakeholders like Matt Carl, who is heading up the Hydrogen Coalition, who agreed that she might be ideal." Next slide. And once API and UGA had lined up the sponsors, they had those sponsors introduce one-page placeholder bills. You can see in this email, this is API providing the language for those bills, which the lawmakers then introduced. And I just want to note that for about a year, the only version of the bill that the public had access to was these one-page placeholders, just a few sentences declaring the legislature's intent to regulate CCS. And meanwhile, the oil and gas industry was working with stakeholders and the lawmakers behind the scenes on a much more substantial bill that didn't become public until late 2024. Next slide. So after the lawmakers introduced those one-page placeholder bills, API began hosting biweekly calls for a group of CCS stakeholders. And you can see these are the folks that were invited to those calls. You've got oil and gas companies like Williams and Shell and TC Energy. Wholesome is a cement manufacturer. Tenaska, Tom mentioned, owns a bunch of natural gas-fired power plants and has proposed a CCS project in the region. And then Battelle is the company that is leading the ARCH2 Hydrogen Hub project. Next slide. Now I'm going to show you a couple examples that I think highlight how the oil and gas corporations are really in the driver's seat throughout this process. So this is an email from Senator Al Landis's aide to an API executive. And at this point, the chairman of the Senate Energy Committee had asked the sponsors if they wanted to do testimony on their bills. And one of the sponsors' aides writes, Senator Landis wanted to ask if we're ready to do sponsor testimony or if you guys are still getting the final pieces of the full legislation since he knew you wanted this to be more of a placeholder. So clearly API and UGA are in the driver's seat here. Next. This is a similar example from a few months later in April of 2024. And I think this shows that, with every version of the bill, API and UGA, we're going back to their members and vetting it with them to make sure it was okay before, giving the thumbs up. So in this email from an API executive to the lawmakers' aides, she writes, "We will distribute to our collective membership for sign off, and at that point, we will have language for a substitute bill to begin the public discussion." So again, industry was ironing everything out behind the scenes before the public had a chance to weigh in. Next slide. This slide kind of goes to a point that Tom made. In this email, it shows that Encino Energy requested changes to the bill, and then the lawmakers' aides then went and made those changes verbatim. So this is another email from the API executive to one of the lawmakers' aides, and in it she writes, "We received the attached this morning, which seeks to tighten up existing language in the original draft bill to prevent any potential CCS impacts to oil and gas assets. These changes were proposed by Encino Energy." Again, lawmakers then made those changes to the bill verbatim, and I think that is the reason why there is a setback for oil and gas assets and not a setback for things like homes, schools, parks. Next slide. Now, in addition to all of the work that they were doing on the text of the bill, API also lined up expert witnesses to testify before House and Senate committees. This is an email from an API executive just showing that coordination. She writes, "Please find bios for the experts planning to present before the Senate Energy and Public Utilities Committee next week." Next slide. And API also provided the handouts that were used to educate lawmakers during those hearings. So this is a handout that API created and sent to Rob Blaisdell's office. I know it's probably too small for you to actually read, but the thing I wanted to highlight about this is that there's no information about safety concerns, any feasibility concerns, or anything negative about CCS. Next slide. I also want to share just what I think is a really interesting tidbit that we found during this research, and that's that at some point API decided to remove the words safe and permanent from these handouts. So in June of 2024, they provided the handout to lawmakers that I just showed you. In April of 2025, they provided an almost identical handout, except the words safe and permanent had been removed. And next slide, please. And they also originally had a line about how landowners would have no liability, and in the later handout, that line has been removed. I think that, the question that I have from this is, does API believe that CCS is safe and permanent? And if they do, why did they remove it from the handouts that they use to educate lawmakers? If anyone from API is on the call and wants to reach out, I'd love to hear from you. The final example that I want to share with you that really highlights the fact that industry was in the driver's seat throughout this process is this. A reporter named Kathy Kolowski from Canary Media has done 2 stories on this CCS bill, and she requested an interview with Rep. Rob Blaisdell, who declined. And so Kolowski sent questions in writing to Rob Blaisdell's office. She posed about a dozen questions. I've screenshotted a few of them here so you can get a sense of them. Rob Blaisdell had previously said that, CCS would bring revenue and jobs to the region. And so here the reporter is asking, can you estimate what those added revenues would be? Can you estimate how many jobs they would provide? The reporter also asked a couple questions about, which companies Rob Blaisdell was working with on the bill, if she was aware of companies that were planning CCS projects in Ohio. So what happened after the reporter sent these questions to Rep. Rob Blaisdell's office is Rob Blaisdell forwarded them to the press, or excuse me, Rob Blaisdell's aide forwarded them to the press office, and then the press office forwarded them to the House Majority Policy Director's office. And it seems that no one could provide an answer to these questions. This is an email from the House Press Secretary to Rob Blaisdell's aide, and in it she writes, "I just went to policy," meaning the policy shop, "and they aren't able to help either, as these are very industry-focused questions. They suggested coordinating with the folks in the industry who have been helping you all with the bill." Eventually, Rob Blaisdell declined to answer the reporter's questions, citing a tight deadline, but I think this shows that apparently no one had an answer for her. Next slide. And another thing that I really want to drive home here is the extraordinary access that the oil and gas corporations have had with some of the people who have sponsored these bills. So this is an email from API's executive director, and he's inviting Senator Brian Chavez to a dinner with some other API executives and some API member company representatives. And this dinner ended up happening about a week later in January of 2025, and it was at Lindy's, which is an upscale restaurant in Columbus, Ohio. Next slide. And a similar example here, Tanaska invited Rep. Rob Blaisdell and Senator Chavez to a dinner at Cooper's Hawk Winery. I'm not sure based on the records whether Rep. Rob Blaisdell attended, but we do know that Senator Chavez attended. And we know that because after the dinner, Tanaska's lobbyist sent an email reading, "Thank you so much for setting up the dinner. It went really well, and he mentioned he had blue lined the CCS legislation. I asked if we could see it so we could address his concerns." And so, I think this proves that they were discussing the CCS legislation at this dinner. Next slide. And I'd like to contrast the extraordinary access that oil and gas corporations have had with the limited access that groups representing concerned citizens have had. And throughout the process, Rep. Rob Blaisdell has held a few interested party meetings. The most recent one that I'm aware of happened in June of 2025, and records show that a whole bunch of industry stakeholders were invited, but folks with the Buckeye Environmental Network were not invited to this interested party meeting. And this is despite the fact that they had reached out repeatedly to her office with concerns about the bill. So if you're an oil and gas corporation, you get one-on-one time at a fancy restaurant. If you're a group of concerned citizens, you're lucky if you get a 30-minute Zoom meeting. Next. So I've thrown a lot of examples out there. The main point that I want to get across it has really been the American Petroleum Institute and the Ohio Oil and Gas Association who are driving this process and who have shaped this bill, and they've done it on behalf of the oil and gas corporations that they represent. Next slide. Now, for the final part of this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about why industry cares and what they're hoping to get out of this legislation. So one, Tom talked about Class 6 primacy. These oil and gas corporations would rather work with the states as opposed to EPA, and so they're trying to push this bill forward so Ohio can apply for Class 6 primacy. Number two, unitization. They would, of course, like to keep the percentage of consenting landowners, or they would like to keep the percentage relatively low. Number three, fees and bonds. They would like to keep the fees and bonds that they have to pay relatively low. And then number four, I'd like to spend a little bit more time on this liability transfer. So the Ohio bill allows CCS developers to transfer liability to the state, to taxpayers, either 50 years after injection has stopped or after certain criteria have been met. And CCS developers will say that this provision is necessary because if they don't have it, they can't get financing. And essentially what they're saying with that is we as taxpayers must assume this liability because the private sector has deemed it too risky. So I think we should all think about whether we want to assume this liability or not. The other thing that I want to point out is that these liability transfer provisions are explicitly modeled off of the frameworks that states use to regulate orphaned and abandoned wells. And this is a quote from API that really underscores that. So this is from the API's Gulf Coast Regional Director. He was speaking before an industry conference in March of last year. And he said, "What about liability and long-term trust fund establishment? We're going to operate this for 25 years. I don't want it to be on my books indefinitely as a liability. How do we transfer that liability over to the state, much in the way that somewhat happens through a plug and abandonment program?" And I think a lot of folks on this call are probably familiar with how the orphan and abandoned well framework has worked out for Ohio, and it has not worked out. Across the country, and particularly in Ohio, there are tens of thousands, by some estimates, hundreds of thousands of orphaned wells. And this regulatory scheme has allowed the oil and gas industry to profit from these wells and then to dump billions of dollars of cleanup costs onto taxpayers. And so I find it very concerning that the provisions within these CCS bills are modeled off of the same framework. Next slide. That concludes my presentation. I do want to say that if you'd like to learn more about this, Kathy Kowalewski wrote an excellent article for Canary Media. We shared all of these documents with her and she references them in her reporting. Next slide. And if you'd really like to dive in, we posted a detailed timeline on our website, which you can see there, fieldnotes.co. It has links to all of the documents, so you're welcome to see kind of where this research came from and how we did it. Also, if you have any questions or you want to talk about this, I love talking about it. My email is there. Please reach out, and looking forward to answering questions at the end. But for now, I'll pass it over to Bev.
Yeah, if you're still on, thanks for continuing to stick around. Now it's Buckeye Environmental Network's turn, and I'll let Kat go first.
All right. Oh, next. Oh, backslide. Thank you. All right. Hello, all. My name is Kat Finneran, and I am co-chair for the board of directors at Buckeye Environmental Network. And for this discussion, Bev and I have two main goals. One is to provide context for our overarching opposition to not just proposals for Class 6 carbon storage injection wells in Ohio, but also our more fundamental opposition to the historically poor management of underground injection waste in the state, as highlighted by the fight over proposed and recently permitted injection wells in Washington County. Slide. So first, always good to do. What do we mean by waste class? I feel like this, we take for granted how shifty we are in our language about this. And keep in mind, this is an extremely complicated and on purpose, mind you, regulatory structure that is also often outright diabolical, with its distinctions between these 6 classes of waste. At BEN, which is our shorthand for Buckeye Environmental Network, we spend most of our time on 3 of the 6 waste classes. Class 2 wells are strictly for oil and gas waste, which volume-wise is dominated by the toxic and radioactive waste used throughout the fracking process. Class 2 wells, while less common, are much more complicated. They can either be hazardous, such as spent pickle liquor from steel manufacturing or plastics productions waste, or Class 1 wells can also be non-hazardous, such as city municipal waste or liquid landfill leachate, and countless more. It's important to note that the fraught distinction between class wells are indicative of fundamental issues with waste classification. For example, elementally, oil and gas waste is radioactive and thus should be categorized as radioactive waste. However, if it was, then the oil and gas industry would collapse from regulatory hurdles. That is the only reason the class well distinction exists. Secondly, when thinking about non-hazardous waste for Class 1 wells, it's helpful to note that most of the liquid waste from the East Palestine train disaster went to 2 Class 1 wells in Ohio. Some of it went to a Class 1 hazardous well in Vickery, Ohio, and some of it went to a Class 1 non-hazardous well in Coshocton, Ohio. Because of all the issues that would clearly come from this, a lot of states have made the permitting behind any class of waste particularly difficult. If you combine the number of Class 2 wells in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, the total is barely 30% of what Ohio has, and neither of them have a single Class 1 waste well. Yet they both produce it, and way more of it than we do. So through a process of elimination, the result is that Ohio ends up getting not just its own waste, but the vast majority of specifically Pennsylvania's waste and a good chunk of West Virginia's waste. Slide. It is also important to keep in mind where different classes of waste tend to be sited. The present day trend is that Class 1 wells tend to be sited on the western and northern parts of the state, the highest volumes going into Allen County in Lima, Ohio, while Class 2 wells tend to be sited along the eastern side with the highest volumes of waste going into Tuscarawas, Guernsey, and of course Washington counties. These 2 wastes have historically been kept separate, mostly to prevent Class 1 hazardous waste, as former state geologist Larry Wickstrom states at the bottom, quote, to protect mineral resources. However, the regulatory mechanisms holding up this separation have been undermined over the past decade, which is demonstrated by the presence of newer Class 1 wells in Coshocton and now the proposed Class 1 well in Washington County by Deep Rock Disposal Solutions. Considering the fact that oil fields in Southeast Ohio are currently filling up with Class 2 waste. I am sure we can all understand why this would have been something to be concerned about for Class 1 wells. And for Class 6 wells, generally we have seen either explorative research or outright proposals across the vast majority of most of the state. Some of them are cited on the western side and some on the eastern side. Slide. So if you walk away from this webinar with anything, personally, I hope for it to be a deep understanding that Ohio is more than anything else a waste state. Because while, yes, the extraction industry looms large here, at the end of the day, what actually makes Ohio unique in conversations about energy justice is not just about what is taken out of this state, but what is put back into it. Combating specifically underground injection waste has been the backbone of our work for almost 27 years. Ben started working on injection waste in 1998 with families in Clyde, Ohio over Class 1 hazardous wastewater contamination at the Vickery well site near Sandusky, Ohio. Eventually, over 35 children would be diagnosed with cancer within a 15-year period. Further, since the beginning of the fracking boom around 2011, Ben has consistently paid particular attention to concerns around Class 2 injection waste. And I wanted to highlight this history both because it informs our point of entry on Class 6 waste injection proposals, but also because we see underground carbon storage not only as a new threat with new risks, but because so many of the proposed sites are located on or around the same formations with injected waste proven to be unstable time and time again. We are more than anything else terrified of the potential harm to the very communities we live in and have been fighting with for decades. Slide. So I made this diagram originally to simply organize connections that I was seeing between Class 1, 2, and 6 wells, not just at the geologic or geographic level, but also financially and politically. And I wanted to share it at this webinar, not really because I need you to read it and quickly absorb and understand it. I know it's a lot, but so that it could provide you with a sort of visual acknowledgement that these classes of waste, while very different in some ways, are also deeply interwoven with each other. Regulations for one type can impact another. Allowances for higher injected pressure of one waste can destabilize another. Massive research and media investments in one type of waste, namely carbon storage, can provide insights into the Class 1 program, which has historically been deeply understudied. The way class waste was broken down originally for economic and political reasons is unstable. It resists this compartmentalization at many levels, and the result is that all three wells, the proposals, the construction, the commercialization, are all more or less trending upward towards another boom, particularly here in Ohio, due to our friendly deregulatory environment. And I would be remiss to not mention that in Ohio, Senator Brian Shattuck, smack dab in the middle of my Venn diagram here, continues to be the least common denominator across this boom for all three wastes. If he isn't profiting off of the fast tracking of Class 2 wells in Marietta, he's laying in wait to profit off of a Class 1 well in the same neighborhood. And of course, is also sponsoring deregulatory legislation concerning Class 6 waste via SB 136. Slide. The conclusion for the state of the ground beneath Ohio is just total destabilization, if not outright rot, from hazardous and toxic waste. If you're from an extractive region, then you have no doubt heard at some point in your life that the geology around you is like Swiss cheese, a notion which is scary enough in and of itself. But here in Ohio, and increasingly in other injection-heavy states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, the long-term problem is not the management of empty pore space, but the overpressurization of unprecedented levels of multi-waste-based chemical interactions. Slide. The conclusion, then, for the state of our politics around injection waste is managing the madness surrounding the legislative push to proliferate the slamming together of all three wastes in real time. This was basically our year at Ben in a nutshell, scattered across the state, chasing one form of injection waste, finding another, seeing half a dozen proposals for pore space that had reached capacity a decade ago, and trying to figure out how to move forward, trying to figure out our next steps. But around March, Washington County made that decision for us. The proposal for an, again, unprecedented Class 1 well in Southeast Ohio in Washington County on top of two Class 2 wells amidst the evidence of multiple well blowouts from Class 2 waste shifted our attention to Marietta, Ohio. Deep Rock Disposal Solutions, and again, State Senator Brian Chavez. What we found in Washington County was no short of a regional mass movement made up of mostly Republicans and long-term supporters of the oil and gas industry, many of who were oil well owners themselves. Next slide. Unable to grasp what I am sure would have been an unviable strategy to combat their own party at the local level, led to a combined effort by the oil and gas lobby and the Senate GOP to discredit Buckeye Environmental Network as outside agitators, an org that has been operating in Ohio for 15 years before Brian Chavez ever even thought to get on a plane to move here. Now, I don't want to minimize the targeted attack on our organization, community partners, our funders, or our intergenerational history of devoting our lives in order to stay in the trenches with communities combating waste issues. But at the same time, we can spot an attempt to distract from the issue at hand a mile away. And we know it's far easier for the pro-big oil Ohio Republican Senate to throw punches at an org focused on environmental justice, or for one of our community partners, like scientist Dr. Randy Poklonadic, was removed from the National Royalty Owners Association conference by a couple of oil corporations because she wanted to talk about CCS. It's easier to fight us than a majority Republican and pro-oil community whose number one concern, aside from keeping their water safe, is preventing the destruction of the oil fields that small producers rely on in the region to heat their homes and take care of their families. Slide. So our main environmental concerns here I think a big one is induced seismicity. We have histories in this state. Class 2 wells were shut down in Youngstown for induced seismicity. A Class 1 well in Ashtabula was shut down because of induced seismicity. And if you look at the table here to the left, you can see I added in yellow the permitting of injection wells in the county and the year they were permitted. And then if you see the way that the number of earthquakes just increasingly ramps up here. And so earthquakes are happening already, and we haven't even started drilling the two Class 2s plus the one. And no doubt there is more. And of course, this is all inside of the webinar on carbon capture. So there's that too, also possibly coming. Throw in, and Julia mentioned it and Tom, but the abandoned and unplugged wells in the state. It is particularly concerning in Marietta. I have zoomed up on Marietta down here. They have, this is like what is it, like, it's like within 50 miles of these injection wells is the first oil well in America. The Thorlin McKee oil well is right here. The very first oil well in the United States is right there. This is the birth of the oil and gas industry. It's a long time, a long amount of just issues with the geology in this area. And so we have no idea how many unplugged and abandoned wells are specifically right here. And again, usually I don't like to narrow in on just one person when the issue is clearly systemic, but considering his committee chair positions and sponsorship of SB 136, Brian Chavez in and of himself is a systemic force. His ownership of a conventional well company, he's got an abandoned well capping company, and is heavily invested in an injection well company, Deep Rock Disposal Solutions, which I will hand off to Bev to talk more about now.
Thanks, Kat. There was a question in the chat about induced seismicity, so I don't know if you want to go back to that slide and define that for folks.
Yeah, I actually wrote it in my notes to define that. Induced seismicity is, so some areas are naturally more, they have more earthquakes, right? Anywhere where you have volcanic activity, you're going to end up with more earthquakes. But what happens with from the the mining to the fracking to the injection waste. The ground is destabilized over and over and over again, and there are natural faults underground in the geology, and all of this construction also creates, it digs into those unnatural faults, and it worsens them, and it creates bigger faults, artificial faults, and that is what creates induced seismicity, especially, and the key here with induced seismicity is high pressure injection. If you inject really hard, really fast, that is what creates that crack more than even a lot over a small or a longer amount of time, it's that volume that's happening in Southeast Ohio right now that is contributing to this.
Thank you. Thank you, Kat. Again, my name is Bev Reed. I'm an organizer with Ben. I'm focused in the Appalachian region. That's where I'm from. I'm from Belmont County. Right now I'm focused on Washington County, and also the carbon capture, which, we're focused on statewide. So as Kat mentioned, the geology here is not ideal for carbon capture. We cannot stress this enough. And we've been working with conventional production well owners in Washington County for the last 7 months and beyond. Many of them own wells surrounding the Class 2 injection wells there. There is a major trend happening there that isn't getting enough attention. The brine has migrated from the injection wells into their wells, or leaked is another term. The ODNR has no systemic, methodical, long-term method of tracking or studying the brine migration issue happening in Southeast Ohio, or perhaps elsewhere in the state. And this is a problem because the ODNR has permitted 2 additional injection wells. I'll describe this slide really quickly here. So this map at the top is of Blasdell's district. And I just wonder if she's aware of this site here and what kind of geology we're looking at and putting this carbon capture into. Down at the bottom, there's a conventional well owner in Washington County holding some of the brine that has migrated into his production well, or that we suspect has migrated there because his well's no longer usable. He had to stop using it to connect to his house, to heat his home, and he had to spend thousands of dollars hooking up to the gas line. And then you have in the middle, that's a bucket of brine from Bob Wilson's well. Bob Wilson has dozens of production wells near an injection well down there in Washington County, and they've all it ruined his business. It's affecting his personal health because he's so stressed about all of it. And it's a real issue, and it's happening all over the county. And then you have the production well head on the right there, and a lot of oil is seeping out of that and coming up to the surface and getting on the ground. And this is just a major trend there. And over on the left side is a pressurized well that is really close to a deep rock injection well. And this well owner has been getting nowhere with ODNR. He's gotten absolutely no help from the state. He has complained for 5 years, and they told him to go pound sand. He also approached the Deep Rock Company to help him as well and to just purchase the well from him, and they told him the same thing. So we can go ahead in the next slide. So this is a problem because the ODNR has permitted 2 additional injection wells on top of the 4 existing wells that are all within 2 miles of 4 aquifers that service 32,000 customers, including the city of Marietta. The same company that owns all of the injection wells in the area, Deep Rock, has also applied for the Class 1 well with the Ohio EPA that's currently under review. The 2 Class 2 wells that were just permitted have not yet been drilled. Just some volumes numbers for you. The total injected volume for the past 10 years into Washington County into Class 2 wells is 2.4 billion gallons of waste, and that is 3,720 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And the totals in the last 10 years into Ohio is 15.2 billion gallons of waste, and that is 23,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Next slide. Okay, Kat.
Yeah, so this was just sort of a really dark discovery I made when we were trying to understand the Class 1 well going into Marietta. This is again, the Class 1 is American Growers number 3. It's also owned by Deep Rock Disposal Solutions. It's important to note when we looked at where it was being injected, because it's not just the geographic location of these things, it's where they are being injected underground. The Class 1 well is being injected into an unprecedented like injection site here in the Oriskany. If you look to the bottom, all the other Class 1 wells in the state of Ohio, I have highlighted them at the bottom. Is where they all are. They're usually in the Mount Simon sandstone. And so this one is much higher north. And it has a much smaller containing like bedrock right above it. And what concerns me about that is, and I've gone over a bunch of like CO2, like I've like made myself sick looking at all of the CO2 proposals in this state and the research, because there's like not a stone unturned there. And one of the trends that comes up is specifically this location for CO2, a little like a county or so north. And this is like, we have not had Class 1 waste in this formation. And we also have like potential attempts to put CO2 waste here. And on the right, what we have is an example from in 2009, again, Ohio, the state of unprecedented waste injection. We had a Class 2 well, two Class 2 wells in Coshocton. They are called the Buckeye Brine wells. They were reformatted to become Class 1 waste wells. It's never happened before in this country, and it happened in Coshocton just a couple years ago. And so, and we're supposed to keep these wastes separate. And so we have a precedent in Ohio to just basically do whatever. And what the nightmare scenario here, as per the title of the slide, is of course that all of this stuff is just cohabiting, potentially could reach a point where it is just cohabiting, because this same formation right here is, as this research here says, it's some of the highest volume Class 2 brine injection wells are also injecting, and it's where the Class 1 is proposed, and it's where again from the research article on CO2 waste. And so there's just it is crowded to say the least, which would concern me if this was any other state but Ohio, where anything goes. Slide.
Okay, this is back to me. So the community in Washington County has absolutely come alive in objection to these wells. Meetings have drawn hundreds of people each time. The city of Marietta passed a resolution seeking a state-enacted moratorium on injection wells in the county due to the issues and concerns of the threats and the increased pressure and volume this waste presents to their aquifers. The backlash the city and parts of the community has faced from the oil and gas industry, and even from representatives, for simply advocating for clean water is unconscionable. City leaders in Marietta are actively trying to, representatives and others are actively trying to intimidate city leaders and other elected officials on water boards in the county. There's a war on science happening on the macro scale. I think we all know about that. And on a micro scale like this. The facts and science indicate that problems are already occurring due to injection wells in Southeast Ohio. The judicious thing to do will be for the state agency to slow down, take a pause, and study the issue, ensuring the water will be protected forever. Not fast-tracking permits, passing legislation that weakens regulations like Senate Bill 219 now being heard in Chavez's Energy Committee would do, and allowing increased volume and pressure to be injected. With data centers being proposed for different parts of Ohio, with carbon capture that they want to tack onto those data centers, including in Washington County, there's a proposal for a data center. Could carbon capture wells be placed in the same areas already overburdened by injection wells and orphaned and abandoned wells, as Kat just mentioned? So there's some pictures here of The victories, the positive aspects here, that's the City Council President of Marietta and the Mayor of Marietta hand delivering their resolution seeking a moratorium on waste wells. And this is historic, folks. I mean, this really is not getting enough attention in the state. It should be statewide news and really national news that Marietta did this. A conservative area, a supermajority Republican county, and they did this because they're concerned. Nobody wants to be a dumping ground. And those are the mailers up at the top there that the oil and gas industry sent around. And it says injection wells help protect our drinking water. That's literally what it says. So next slide. Okay. As we've seen in Washington County, this is not a left versus right issue. Clean, drinkable water and efforts to protect it are not political, as much as the people who stand to profit want you to think they are. The coalition standing up in the county is made up of people from all political backgrounds. And just a note about Buckeye, we've been working on injection wells for over 15 years. We're Ohioans, some of us are Appalachians, and unlike people with vested interests who are the true outsiders, we care about the health of our fellow Ohioans in this land we live on in the beautiful, incredible area we call home. And here's some success story pictures here, just the people fighting back, hundreds of people at meetings. It's been great. Next slide. So we share this all with you to make the point that nobody wants to be a dumping ground for waste, and carbon dioxide is waste. Communities have fought back against CCS projects before in Ohio. There was a project that was stopped in Darke County over a decade ago. And we expect similar trends to happen when companies get serious about bringing these projects into neighborhoods in Ohio. The House of Representatives held hearings on the House Bill 170 CCS bill earlier this year, and it became apparent to us as we were talking to some of these representatives on the very few meetings we got that all of the reps knew very little about carbon capture. And even the people in the Natural Resources Committee, you would think they would know a little bit more, but they didn't. And they're voting on bills without knowing enough about the complex nature and the risks this would pose. Rep. Blasdell falsely stated there was no opposition to the bills when asked in committee earlier this year. Contrary to this statement, we worked with folks this past May and had a great turnout to the opposition testimony day. 10 people spoke and many more submitted testimony. We did a webinar, Buckeye did a webinar on carbon capture in April with our partner, Dr. Randy Pokladnik, and Kat also presented there. If you'd like more in-depth look at the technical aspects of CCS and the risks from a scientist, Dr. Randy, we will share that resource with you as well, and we'll put the link in the chat here in a moment. The bills would give ODNR primacy over the Class 6 wells. ODNR already has a poor track record of regulating what it currently has to, which we just explained to you. The bills would squash landowner rights, transfer the long-term liability onto taxpayers, and prioritize industry benefits over people. Also that companies can continue to emit carbon dioxide to get a tax break. That's what this is for, so they can continue as normal what they do. This is the opposite direction that we need to go in at this time. And lastly, I'd like to point out that we hold these webinars to build a coalition of people that will advocate and keep track of this stuff. We're a small group, but we're mighty, and we hope that you will get involved after attending this webinar and you share this with others. And I hope everyone here really does something, not just take in the information, but actually act on it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Bev and Kat and Tom and Julie for your presentations. That wraps up our programming for this evening, so we'd like to move into Q&A now. Please feel free to drop your questions again, either in the chat or in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But maybe we could start by answering a question, Tom, about the mechanics of Class 6 carbon injection wells. How do they work? And what sorts of risks do they pose to communities?
Yeah, great question. for people who want it, I think I answered this question in the like Q&A form. So there's a link to a resource from EPA that talks a little bit more about these. But the way that this works, the CO2 is either captured again from one of these industrial facilities or in CO2 capture, or from the ambient air in what's called direct air capture. So it's not necessarily tied to a point source emitter, just kind of CO2 from anywhere. And then that is then pressurized and compressed into what is called a supercritical fluid, which is like not quite a liquid, not quite a gas, has properties of both. And then that's injected into a well, like deep into these target geologic formations, where the hope is that that CO2 will then either be physically trapped, right? There'll be kind of a cap rock, something that prevents the CO2 from escaping back into the air, or over time that CO2 will interact with the surrounding geology and then, kind of mineralize or be trapped or something along those lines. So, and that's a process that plays out over hundreds or thousands of years. So that's generally how that works. And, the nature of that, right? I think kind of like, or what I outlined, I think kind of like alludes to a lot of these issues, right? Like, the fact that involves a mechanical process, like in a well, right? Wells can fail. The volumes of CO2 involved, the high pressures, then kind of pose some risks too, right? Where is the CO2 gonna stay where it's injected, right? How well do we understand the underlying geology? IEFA has a really great report that maybe we can drop in the chat that looks at primarily two CO2 storage projects in Norway, and one of the best studied geologies in the world, and even in that context, right, where there's just a significant amount of information, and I think a pretty strong regulatory environment for these kinds of projects. They encountered a lot of unknowns, right, and I think a lot of that report kind of reflects how dynamic the process is, right. It changes over time. There's a lot of uncertainties. And so, those wells encountered, or those storage projects encountered, some pretty serious issues, like signs that storage projects were rejecting the CO2, right? There were places where the CO2 was escaping into places that it shouldn't have been, right? And then, in that example, the reason that it didn't, see catastrophic failures, there's a rock that they were previously unaware of, right? That then kind of trapped the CO2 in place, right? And so I think about that report a lot, because I think it's, again, just a really deep dive into again primarily two storage facilities. But again, because of the nature of CO2, that it's injected underground, it's interacting with other things, potentially there are impurities, in the CO2 stream. There's, potential for this to kind of migrate into drinking water. So those are some of the risks, right? Potentially wellhead blowouts. And then you kind of bring in the CO2 pipeline transportation as well, which someone messaged us earlier about Satartia. So there was that pipeline rupture a few years back in Mississippi that led to a lot of hospitalizations. And anyway, so yeah, some of the risks associated with CO2 storage.
Thanks so much, Tom. We've had several questions about the resources that Tom mentioned, resources that were shared in the presentation, as well as the recording of tonight's webinar. We'll make sure to share a link to the recording of tonight's presentation via email, probably tomorrow or later. And we will also include several of those resources that have been mentioned tonight. So thanks for those questions.
I just want to mention in
Yeah.
the chat there was
hmm
a comment that Hilliard City Council is encouraging Amazon to use
Yeah.
CCS at a data center that's planning to use gas fuel cells and that were permitted without a hearing. So if anyone lives there or knows anyone and wants to learn more about that, reach out.
Thanks, Bev. We've also got a question about where to find current injection wells and abandoned wells in a particular county. Kat, is that something you could speak to, where to locate those?
Yeah, so Frac Tracker is a pretty good resource for this. But it's sort of all over the place and it's really shifting. Frac Tracker is probably the best. Some of theirs are a little outdated, but there is, this is going to sound bizarre and I can try to link to this, but I recently stumbled upon TEDx like 2000 GIS maps that are all public. And there's a lot of really great data like data collection and like specifically on Ohio and in our injection wells. And it's really like it needs to be done like an up to date. And it's something we've talked about a lot at Ben because it's something Teresa Mills used to do. But it really needs to be better done because they shut down and they restart and they're permitting, and so it's we never really know. We always have to say approximately how many wells in a given state because yeah, it's in flux all the time.
Thank you.
I just want to mention, I don't know if you were going to address that comment about carbonic acid forming when with water,
Yeah, go for it, Beth. That'd be
releasing
great.
it. Well, I'm not a scientist, but I do know that that is a real risk here, and I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that too. But that I'll put it in the link in the chat again. But when we did our presentation in April, that YouTube video there, we kind of went into depth on that. So I'll post it again.
That'd be great. Fantastic. Yeah, there's another question about other let's see, other incidents of CCS pipeline leaks. I know that there was one in the Gulf Coast. Was that last year, Tom, or in
I think
Denver?
so. Yeah, I think there's been one other one too. We can make sure to include
Yeah.
some links to information about those incidents in our follow-up.
Hmm. A question about the tax breaks driving CCS. Can we speak a bit to where that initiative is coming from? Who's driving the funding for carbon capture and storage?
Yeah, actually, there's a really wonderful analysis by I'm actually blanking on her last name right now, by a woman named Lindsay who used to work for ExxonMobil, and she has done an analysis of the lobbying that went into the Inflation Reduction Act, which boosted the 45Q tax credit from $50 to $85. And so that was an effort that it's very clearly led by the fossil fuel industry to boost that tax credit. And I will find a link to her analysis and make sure we share that.
Thank you, Julia. Um, a question for the whole group. What do you all envision as next steps for more collective efforts? What can concerned folks do um, to make a difference here tonight?
I have I have a thought here. I think one of the things that is important is I think visibilizing injection wells, the class two, because we've been pretty focused in a handful of counties, but they're in dozens of counties. Um, and like we've been triaging this for so many years that it would be nice for like other people to just like see these injection wells. But then also like I know there are two different types of wells, the class one and the class two. Um, but the class one covers the northwest part of the state. The class two covers the southwest part of the state. And so, or southeast part of the state. And so you get full coverage on injection 101. And I really think that it serves as almost like an English as a first language. The injection one and two really help people understand six because the where we see people pick up on the class six stuff the quickest are the places where these injection fights have been going on the longest. And so I think like number one is in order to understand class six is I think like we just need to talk about injection wells a lot more and not just keep that conversation in Appalachian, Ohio, because they're all over the state and they're probably going to get a lot worse. So yeah.
Tom, Julia, Bev, anything you'd like to add about next steps from tonight's presentation?
I would just say keep in touch with us, like reach out to us directly. We really are grassroots and we will do a one-on-one with you if you really are passionate about this and you want to do something. We will talk with you and brainstorm. You can we have brine calls every week, where we brainstorm there. And then call your legislators, obviously, and just bug them, a lot, and stay loud and I think it's like a marathon, it's not a sprint. So you just have to keep educating yourself over time. And yeah.
Yeah, something I can suggest is, I mentioned that there are those five Class 6 permit applications in Ohio. I also misspoke earlier. There are two projects in West Virginia that I think will move next year. I don't think the Ohio ones will move, but I still think people should be keeping an eye on them. And, those are potentially like multi-year permit reviews. I think like the federal EPA, like federal regulators, their like internal target for issuing Class 6 permit decisions is 2 years after the application has been determined to be complete, right? And that timeline has typically been longer just based on past experience. And so like that's a lot of runway, I think, for residents to work with throughout the process. The application will be made available. You could do records requests. Once the EPA, announces that they're ready to make a decision on those CO2 storage projects, there'll be a comment period, and residents have the ability to request a public meeting, right? And even before it gets to that point, right, the company will, either before or after submitting an application, will also be, looking to drill stratigraphic test wells, right? These are like they fall kind of within the catch-all Class 5 well class. Some of this I think is already happening in like Ohio and West Virginia related to some of the proposed projects, right? But again, that gives you a sense of where these projects are even before some of these documents have been released, and is a great opportunity to talk to your neighbors and certainly your local officials about what to expect in the coming years. So I wouldn't sleep on the individual facilities themselves, but certainly I think like anything to do to shape the policy environment, including participating in the rulemaking once the Ohio bill has been passed, I think is really important because again, that's kind of the environment that's going to determine a lot of about how these projects are going to function in the future if they're developed.
Thanks, Tom. All right, folks. Well, again, we will send around a link to this presentation very shortly. We will include resources which will cover, again, the technical aspects of all the processes we've covered tonight. I'll also drop in everyone's contact information so you can get in touch if you'd like to learn more and stay involved. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Thanks to our presenters, and we hope you all have a great evening.
Thanks all.
Thanks for joining.